The beginning of trouble. It was a warm Saturday morning in the small suburban neighborhood of Meadowridge, where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns and picket fences that told stories of families who cherished their slice of comfort. The scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the aroma of blooming flowers, creating an atmosphere of tranquility. Children's laughter rang out as a group of kids played a lively game of basketball at the court near the park. The court wasn't fancy, just a paved rectangle with a hoop at either end. But to the kids, it was a world of fun and competition. They ranged in age from 10 to 13, a mix of friends who spent their weekends dribbling basketballs, trading jokes, and challenging one another to impossible shots. Among them were Darren, the confident shot caller, Keisha, quick and agile on her feet, and Malik, the tallest of the bunch with an easygoing smile that never left his face. From across the street, however, the laughter sounded different to one man. Walter Briggs, a retiree in his early 60s, sat on the front porch of his house. He sipped his coffee while his face twisted in irritation. His home, though well-kept, sat in sharp contrast to the vibrant life around him. The paint was faded, the garden overgrown, and the mailbox hung slightly askew. Walter rarely spoke to anyone in the neighborhood, choosing instead to watch from a distance, his interactions limited to a polite nod or a gruff "good morning." But today the sound of bouncing basketballs and joyful shouts grated on his nerves. Walter adjusted his glasses and leaned forward in his rocking chair. His eyes locked onto the kids, and he felt a surge of unease. They didn't fit the image of Meadowridge he had grown used to over the years. They were outsiders, or so he told himself, and their presence didn't sit well with him. "What's the world coming to?" Walter muttered under his breath. He took another sip of his coffee, trying to convince himself to ignore it, but the noise seemed to grow louder, more intrusive. Unable to shake his discomfort, Walter reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the keypad for a moment as doubt crept in. What was he going to say? That kids were playing basketball too loudly. It felt ridiculous, but his irritation outweighed his hesitation. When the police dispatcher answered, Walter found himself embellishing the situation. "There's a group of kids causing a disturbance at the basketball court," he said, his voice steady but tinged with annoyance. "They've been there all morning, making a racket. I don't know if they live around here. Can you send someone to check it out?" The dispatcher assured him that an officer would be sent, and Walter hung up, feeling a grim satisfaction. He had done his part, he thought. The street would be peaceful again soon. He settled back into his chair, ignoring the small voice in his head that asked if he overreacted. At the court, Darren was about to make a three-point shot when the faint sound of approaching sirens caught his attention. The others paused, their laughter fading as they turned to look. The flashing lights of a police cruiser came into view, followed by a second car. The sight of the police unsettled the group. None of them could think of a reason the officers would be there. "Maybe they're looking for someone," Keisha whispered, trying to keep her voice calm. "Yeah, but why here?" Malik replied, his brow furrowed. The cars came to a stop at the edge of the court. Two officers stepped out, their expressions serious. One, a tall man with a stern face, walked toward the kids while his partner scanned the area. "Hey, what's going on?" Darren asked cautiously as the first officer approached. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced down at a notepad in his hand. "What are you kids doing here?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Playing basketball," Darren replied, his voice steady but confused. "Why? Did something happen?" The officer's gaze swept over the group, lingering just a moment too long on each of their faces. "Do you live around here?" he asked. "Do you have permission to use this court?" Keisha stepped forward. "We've been coming here for months. Nobody's ever said we needed permission." The officer frowned but didn't respond. His partner joined him, muttering something under his breath before speaking louder. "We got a call about a disturbance," he said. "Who called it in?" "We're just playing a game," Malik said, frustration creeping into his voice. "We're not disturbing anyone." The officers exchanged glances, their presence intimidating even without raised voices or drawn weapons. The tension in the air was palpable, and the kids stood frozen, unsure of what to do or say. Across the street, Walter watched from his porch, his arms crossed. He expected the officers to handle the situation quickly and quietly, but the sight of the kids standing stiff and scared began to weigh on him. They weren't shouting or causing chaos. They weren't even arguing with the police. They looked confused, hurt. For a fleeting moment, Walter felt a pang of guilt. Maybe he'd misjudged them. Maybe he'd overreacted. But just as quickly, he pushed the thought aside. "They shouldn't have been here in the first place," he muttered. The sound of another car pulling up drew his attention. A sleek black sedan stopped in front of his house, and a woman in her late 30s stepped out. She wore a professional outfit, her expression sharp and purposeful. Walter recognized her immediately, his daughter, Rebecca. Rebecca glanced at the scene unfolding at the court, her jaw tightening as she took it in. Without a word, she turned and marched up to the porch, her heels clicking against the pavement. Walter stood up, bracing himself for what he knew was coming. "What did you do, Dad?" Rebecca asked, her voice low and cutting. Walter tried to feign ignorance. "I don't know what you mean." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "You called the cops on those kids, didn't you?" "They were being loud," Walter said defensively. "They don't even live around here." Rebecca's face twisted in disbelief. "Do you even hear yourself? You called the police because some kids were playing basketball. Do you know how dangerous that could have been for them?" Walter faltered, unable to meet her gaze. Rebecca stepped closer, her voice rising. "Those kids did nothing wrong, and you just decided they didn't belong. Do you realize what you've done?" Walter opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time in years, he felt small, his actions laid bare for what they were. Rebecca didn't wait for an explanation. She turned and walked toward the court, her presence commanding attention as she approached the officers. Walter watched helplessly as his daughter stepped into the fray, knowing deep down that he had made a mistake he couldn't undo. The reckoning begins. Rebecca approached the basketball court, her posture rigid and her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. The officers turned to face her as she arrived, their stern expressions softening slightly. They weren't expecting a confrontation, but Rebecca's presence demanded attention. "Good afternoon, officers," Rebecca began, her voice firm yet controlled. "I'm Rebecca Briggs, and I'd like to know what exactly is happening here." The taller officer cleared his throat. "We received a report of a disturbance," he said, "a group of kids playing basketball." Rebecca's eyebrow arched, her sharp gaze cutting into the officer like a scalpel. And this required not one but two patrol cars. She gestured toward the flashing lights. "Do you often investigate reports of children playing in a park as though they're armed robbers?" The officer looked momentarily flustered. "Ma'am, we're just responding to a call. It's standard protocol." "Standard protocol," Rebecca interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "Does your protocol also include intimidating a group of kids who've done nothing wrong, or is that a personal choice?" The shorter officer stepped forward, his tone defensive. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job. We didn't mean any harm." Rebecca took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew anger wouldn't help here, but the sight of the children, visibly shaken, fueled her determination. She turned to the kids, her expression softening. "Are you all okay?" she asked gently. Darren, standing at the front of the group, nodded hesitantly. "We're fine," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just confused." Rebecca's heart ached at the vulnerability in his tone. She glanced at the officers, her expression hardening again. "You've done enough here. These kids aren't a threat, and they don't need your protocol. You can leave now." The taller officer hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Understood, ma'am," he said. He motioned to his partner, and they began walking back to their cars. The flashing lights were turned off, and the vehicles pulled away, leaving the street in an eerie silence. Rebecca turned back to the kids, crouching slightly to meet their eyes. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said softly. "You didn't deserve it, and I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure it doesn't happen again." The kids nodded, some still looking unsure. Darren spoke up, his voice steady now. "Thanks, ma'am. It's not the first time something like this has happened, but it's nice to know someone's on our side." Rebecca's jaw tightened at his words. Not the first time. The thought made her stomach churn, but she kept her composure. "You belong here just as much as anyone else," she said firmly. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." As the kids resumed their game, Rebecca turned and made her way back to Walter's house, her fury barely contained. She found her father still sitting on the porch, his shoulders slumped and his face pale. He looked up as she approached, his expression a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. "What were you thinking?" Rebecca demanded, crossing her arms as she stood over him. Walter sighed, rubbing his temples. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone," he said weakly. I didn't know them. They were loud, and I thought." "You thought what?" Rebecca snapped. "That they were criminals. That they didn't belong here. Do you even realize how dangerous that call could have been for them?" Walter's gaze fell to the ground. He didn't have an answer, and Rebecca's words hung heavily in the air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Rebecca sat down on the porch steps, her voice softer now, but no less serious. "Dad, I've spent my entire career fighting to protect kids like them from situations exactly like this. Do you know how often things like this escalate because of people's assumptions? Because someone decides they don't belong?" Walter swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't. Rebecca's words cut too deep, and he couldn't deny the truth in them. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said quietly. "I just didn't want trouble." Rebecca shook her head, her disappointment evident. "They weren't the ones causing trouble, Dad. You were." Walter felt his throat tighten, and for a moment he thought he might cry. He hadn't cried in years, not even when his wife passed away. But now, sitting on his porch with his daughter, looking at him like a stranger, he felt something breaking inside him. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think. Rebecca looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You didn't think because you didn't have to," she said. "You've lived your whole life in this bubble, assuming the worst about anyone who doesn't fit into it. But those kids, they're just kids. They're not a threat. They're not outsiders. They're part of this community, whether you like it or not." Walter nodded, unable to meet her gaze. He knew she was right. He had spent years isolating himself, letting his fears and prejudices fester. And now, those choices had come back to haunt him. "I want to make it right," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I don't know how, but I want to." Rebecca's expression softened slightly, though her resolve remained firm. "It's not going to be easy, Dad," she said. "You can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to normal. You have to change. You have to do the work." Walter nodded again, his mind racing with uncertainty. He didn't know where to start or how to undo the damage he had caused, but he knew he had to try. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a fragile but powerful desire to be better, a fragile beginning. Walter Briggs spent the next few days in a haze of self-reflection, his daughter's words echoing in his mind. Rebecca had left that night, her parting words more a challenge than a reassurance. "You have to do the work." But what did that even mean? Walter wasn't sure where to begin. For years, he had walled himself off from the world, comfortable in his solitude and secure in his assumptions about the way things were. Now those walls felt like a prison. On Tuesday morning, Walter found himself staring out his kitchen window at the basketball court across the street. The kids were back, their laughter carrying across the neighborhood. It was the same group as before: Darren, Keisha, Malik, and a few others, all absorbed in their game. The sight filled him with a mix of regret and apprehension. He wanted to approach them, to make things right, but fear held him back. What if they didn't want to hear from him? What if he made things worse? The sound of a knock at the door startled him. When he opened it, he found Rebecca standing there, a folder tucked under her arm. "I'm not here to lecture you," she said before he could speak, "but we need to talk." Walter stepped aside, motioning her in. She took a seat at the kitchen table and set the folder down in front of her. "I've been thinking about what you said," Walter began hesitantly, sitting across from her. "I want to make it right, Rebecca. I don't know how." Rebecca nodded, her expression serious. "That's a start. But wanting to make it right isn't enough. You need to understand why this happened in the first place." She opened the folder, revealing articles, reports, and printouts. "I brought some things for you to read. Stories about what happens when assumptions and biases lead to actions like yours. And not just in far-off places, Dad. Right here in communities like ours." Walter hesitated, glancing at the papers. I'm not sure I can handle all that," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can," Rebecca said firmly. "You need to, because this isn't just about those kids. It's about the way you see the world, the way you've chosen to isolate yourself and let fear dictate your actions." Her words stung, but Walter knew she was right. He reached for the folder, flipping through the articles. One headline caught his eye: "A Game Gone Wrong. How Prejudice Turned a Simple Afternoon into Tragedy." His hands trembled as he scanned the story, his chest tightening with guilt. Rebecca watched him closely, her voice softer now. "It's hard to face, I know. But if you're serious about changing, this is where it starts. Understanding what you've done and why it matters." Walter nodded, his throat tight. "I'll read them," he promised. "All of them." Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Good," she said, "but there's more to it than just reading. You need to engage with the community you've been avoiding. Get to know the people you've judged from a distance. That's how you start to break down those walls." Walter frowned. The idea of stepping out of his comfort zone, of interacting with people he barely knew, filled him with anxiety. But he also knew Rebecca was right. "How do I even do that?" he asked. "Where do I start?" Rebecca gave him a small smile, one that carried a hint of encouragement. "Why don't you start with the kids?" That afternoon, Walter stood on his porch, clutching a basketball in his hands. It was old and slightly deflated, a relic from years ago when his son used to play in the driveway. He had dusted it off that morning, unsure if it was a good idea but desperate to try. Across the street, the kids were finishing a game. Darren's team had just won, and they were laughing and teasing each other as they gathered around the hoop. Walter hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath and stepped off the porch. As he approached the court, the kids noticed him and fell silent. Darren frowned, his expression guarded. Keisha crossed her arms, watching Walter closely. Malik tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Walter stopped a few feet away, the basketball resting at his side. "Hi," he said, his voice cracking slightly. I wanted to talk to you all, if that's okay." The kids exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of him. Finally, Darren spoke. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone cautious. Walter shifted uncomfortably, gripping the ball tighter. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for what happened the other day. For calling the police. It was wrong, and I'm sorry." The kids were silent for a moment, their expressions a mix of surprise and skepticism. Darren narrowed his eyes. "Why'd you do it?" he asked bluntly. "What did we ever do to you?" Walter's face flushed with shame. "You didn't do anything," he admitted. "That's the truth. I let my own assumptions get the better of me. I saw you out here, and instead of seeing kids having fun, I saw Trouble. And that was wrong. I'm trying to understand why I thought that way. But in the meantime, I wanted to tell you I'm sorry. Truly. Keisha uncrossed her arms, her gaze softening slightly. You scared us, she said. We didn't know what was going on. We thought we were in real trouble. Walter nodded, his chest tightening. I know, he said, and I can't undo that. But I want to make it right. I want to show you that I can do better. Malik stepped forward, eyeing the basketball in Walter's hands. You play? He asked, his tone neutral but curious. Walter gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. Not in a long time, he admitted. But I used to. My son and I used to shoot hoops in the driveway when he was your age. Malik considered this for a moment, then held out his hand. Let's see what you got. Walter hesitated, then smiled. He handed Malik the ball, and the boy dribbled it a few times before passing it back. Walter caught it and took a shot, the ball arcing through the air before bouncing off the rim. The kids laughed, and Walter couldn't help but laugh with them. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. For the first time in years, Walter felt a connection, a fragile but genuine bond forming between him and the kids he had wronged. That evening, as Walter sat on his porch, Rebecca called. How'd it go? She asked. Walter smiled, the sound of the kids' laughter still ringing in his ears. Better than I expected, he said. But I know I've got a long way to go. Rebecca's voice softened. You're starting, Dad. That's what matters. For the first time, Walter felt like he was truly beginning to understand what it meant to do the work. It wasn't about grand gestures or quick fixes. It was about showing up, owning his mistakes, and proving, one small step at a time, that he could be better. Bridges begin to build. The following week brought more opportunities for Walter Briggs to confront his past and build a new future. Every day, he found himself drawn to the basketball court. It wasn't easy. Each step toward the kids felt like crossing an invisible chasm, but the more time he spent there, the more he realized just how much he had missed out on by isolating himself from the world around him. On Thursday afternoon, Walter stood near the court again, watching the kids play. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked right up to the edge and called out, "Need an extra player." The kids turned toward him, surprised but not unwelcoming. Darren smirked. You sure you're up for it, old man? Walter chuckled. I'll give it a shot. Just don't laugh too hard when I miss. Keisha tossed him the ball, her smile breaking through her usual wariness. All right then, you're on my team. Walter hadn't played basketball in decades, and his body protested with every movement. His joints ached, his reflexes were slow, and his aim was embarrassing. But none of that mattered. The kids were patient with him, laughing when he missed a shot, but also cheering when he managed to score. By the time they finished the game, Walter was drenched in sweat, his breathing heavy. He leaned on his knees, grinning despite himself. I don't think I've run that much in 20 years, he admitted. Not bad for a rookie, Malik said, slapping him on the back. Walter laughed, the tension that had gripped him for so long finally starting to loosen. Thanks for letting me join, he said. It means a lot. Darren shrugged, his expression softening. You're not as bad as we thought. Walter smiled, realizing that this small gesture, a simple game of basketball, was doing more to bridge the gap than any words could have. The next day, Walter decided to take Rebecca's advice and engage more deeply with the community. He began by walking to the local community center, a place he hadn't set foot in since its grand opening years ago. Inside, he found a bustling hub of activity. Kids playing board games, adults attending workshops, and seniors chatting over coffee. At the front desk, a cheerful woman greeted him. Good afternoon. How can I help you? Walter hesitated, then cleared his throat. I was wondering if there's anything I can do to volunteer, he said. Something with the kids, maybe. The woman's eyes lit up. We're always looking for volunteers, she said. Do you have any particular skills or interests? Walter thought for a moment. Well, I used to work in construction, he said. I'm pretty handy with tools. That's perfect, the woman said. We've been wanting to start a woodworking class for the kids, but we haven't had anyone to lead it. Would you be interested? Walter nodded, feeling a spark of excitement he hadn't felt in years. I'd like that. The following week, Walter began teaching a woodworking class at the community center. The kids who signed up were a mix of regular attendees and newcomers, including Darren, Keisha, and Malik. Walter was nervous at first, unsure if he could connect with them in this new way, but the kids quickly warmed to him. The first project was simple: birdhouses. Walter showed the group how to measure and cut the wood, how to sand the edges smooth, and how to assemble the pieces with care. The kids listened attentively, their initial skepticism giving way to curiosity and enthusiasm. Like this? Darren asked, holding up a piece of wood he had just cut. Walter examined it, nodding approvingly. That's perfect. Nice work. Keisha, who had been unusually quiet during the class, spoke up. Why birdhouses? She asked, her tone curious rather than critical. Walter smiled. When I was a kid, my dad and I used to build them together, he said. We'd hang them in the backyard and watch the birds move in. It was one of the few things we really connected over. The room fell silent for a moment as the kids processed this personal detail. It was the first time Walter had opened up to them, and it seemed to bridge a small but significant gap. Malik grinned. Well, I'm gonna paint mine bright red. The birds won't be able to miss it. The group laughed, and Walter felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he felt like he was truly part of something, not just an observer on the sidelines. As the weeks went on, Walter's woodworking class became a hit. The kids looked forward to it, and Walter found himself looking forward to their company just as much. He started to learn more about their lives, their dreams, their struggles, their unique perspectives. Darren wanted to be an architect. I love drawing buildings, he told Walter one afternoon. I want to design a skyscraper someday. Keisha was passionate about animals. I'm gonna be a veterinarian, she said confidently. I already volunteer at the shelter. Malik had a knack for storytelling. I'm gonna write a book one day, he said. Something big, like Harry Potter. Walter listened intently, marveling at their ambition and resilience. These were the same kids he had once judged unfairly, and now he saw them for who they really were: bright, driven, and full of potential. One evening, as Walter packed up after class, Rebecca stopped by the community center. She stood in the doorway, watching him help Darren load a finished birdhouse into a box. You've come a long way, Dad, she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. Walter turned to her, his expression thoughtful. I had a lot to learn, he admitted. Still do. Rebecca smiled, stepping closer. Learning's the first step. What you're doing here, it matters. Walter nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. For years, he had lived in fear of change, but now he embraced it. The kids had taught him more than he ever expected, and he knew his journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He wasn't just making amends, he was becoming a better person. And as he locked up the community center that night, the sound of laughter and the sight of smiling faces stayed with him, a reminder that redemption wasn't just possible, it was worth every effort. Redemption finds roots. Walter Briggs's woodworking classes had become more than just a weekly activity. They were a highlight of his days, a chance to connect with the kids and rediscover a sense of purpose. The workshop had evolved into a lively space of creativity and camaraderie. Walter marveled at how the children brought their own ideas to life, their projects reflecting their unique personalities. It wasn't just about the birdhouses anymore. It was about the connections they were building with each other and with him. But as much as Walter felt himself growing, he also knew there were lingering doubts about his sincerity. Apologies and efforts were one thing, but trust had to be earned. And earning trust from the kids and the community meant more than teaching them skills. It meant showing that he was willing to take responsibility for his mistakes and work to make things better. One rainy afternoon, as Walter was packing up the woodworking materials after a class, Darren approached him. The boy had grown comfortable around Walter, but today he seemed hesitant, his usual confidence replaced by a quieter demeanor. "Mr. Briggs?" Darren asked, fidgeting with the edge of his hoodie. Walter looked up, sensing the boy's unease. "What's on your mind, Darren?" Darren hesitated, then blurted out, "Why did you call the cops on us that day?" Walter froze. He had hoped this question wouldn't come, though he knew it was inevitable. Taking a deep breath, he set down the tools in his hands and pulled up a stool. "That's a fair question," Walter said, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "The truth is, Darren, I let my assumptions get the better of me. I saw a group of kids I didn't know, and instead of taking the time to understand what you were doing, I jumped to conclusions. It was wrong, more wrong than I can ever explain. And I'm sorry for the hurt I caused." Darren's eyes searched Walter's face, looking for signs of insincerity. "But why? We weren't doing anything bad." Walter nodded, his chest tightening. "You're right. You weren't. And that's what I've been struggling with. I realize now that my assumptions came from fear. Fear of change. Fear of the unknown. And maybe even fear of admitting that I didn't understand the world as well as I thought I did. But I'm trying to do better, Darren. Not just for myself, but for all of you." Darren was quiet for a moment, then said, "It hurt, you know. When the police came, we thought something bad was going to happen." Walter's heart sank. "I know, and that's what keeps me up at night. I can't take back what I did, but I promise you this, I'll never make that mistake again, and I'll do everything I can to make sure no one else does, either." Darren nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I believe you. Just don't forget what it felt like, what it did to us." "I won't," Walter assured him. "I promise." Walter's conversation with Darren stayed with him for days. He realized that words alone would never be enough. He needed to take action, not just for the kids, but for the entire neighborhood. The mistake he'd made had affected more than just Darren, Keisha, and Malik. It had rippled through the community, creating a divide he now felt responsible for mending. One evening, Walter sat down with Rebecca to share his plan. She listened carefully, her expression a mix of surprise and admiration. "I want to organize a neighborhood gathering," Walter said, "something that brings everyone together. I want to show the kids, and everyone else, that this is their community too, and that they belong here." Rebecca nodded slowly. "That's a good idea, Dad. But it won't be easy. Some people might not be ready to forgive, and others might not even want to come." Walter sighed. "I know, but I have to try. If I can bring even a few people together, it'll be worth it." Over the next few weeks, Walter worked tirelessly to bring his idea to life. He reached out to neighbors, local businesses, and community leaders, explaining his vision for the event. Rebecca helped him design flyers, and Malik offered to spread the word among his friends. The event, which Walter decided to call the Unity and Community Festival, was planned for a Saturday afternoon at the park. There would be food, games, music, and even a showcase of the woodworking projects the kids had created in class. Walter was nervous but determined, pouring his heart into every detail. The day of the festival dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that seemed made for new beginnings. Walter arrived at the park early, setting up tables and arranging decorations. Rebecca was by his side, her encouragement keeping him grounded. Slowly, people began to trickle in. Families with young children, teenagers, and older neighbors Walter hadn't spoken to in years. To Walter's relief, Darren, Keisha, and Malik were among the first to arrive, each of them carrying their woodworking projects. Keisha's birdhouse was painted in soft pastels, while Darren's had intricate geometric patterns. Malik's, true to his word, was bright red with bold black stripes. "Looks like you've all outdone yourselves," Walter said, his pride evident. "Yours doesn't look too bad either," Darren replied, grinning. The festival soon came to life, the air filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and the sizzling of grills. Walter moved through the crowd, greeting neighbors and introducing himself to those he didn't know. He felt a sense of connection he hadn't experienced in years, a feeling of belonging that went beyond his front porch. As the sun began to set, Rebecca took the microphone and called for everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming to the first Unity in Community Festival," she said, her voice warm and steady. "This event wouldn't have been possible without the hard work and dedication of my father, Walter Briggs." Walter felt his face flush as the crowd turned to him, clapping and cheering. He stepped up to the microphone, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't have much to say," Walter began, his voice wavering. "But I do want to thank each and every one of you for being here today. A few months ago, I made a mistake that hurt people I care about and divided this community. Today, I'm trying to make up for that, one step at a time. This festival isn't just about coming together. It's about showing that we're stronger when we stand united, when we see each other for who we really are, not as strangers, but as neighbors." The crowd erupted in applause, and Walter stepped back, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and gratitude. As the festival wound down, Darren approached Walter, holding his birdhouse. "You did good today, Mr. Briggs," he said, his voice sincere. Walter smiled, his eyes glistening. "Thanks, Darren. That means more than you know." For the first time in years, Walter felt a sense of peace. He wasn't just a man sitting on a porch anymore. He was part of a community he was proud to call his own. And he knew that his journey wasn't over. Redemption wasn't a destination. It was a path he would continue to walk, one small step at a time. A new chapter. The success of the Unity in Community Festival marked a turning point not only for Walter Briggs, but for the entire neighborhood. What had begun as an effort to make amends had blossomed into something far greater, a renewed sense of togetherness and understanding in a community that had grown quietly fractured over the years. Morning reflections. A few days after the festival, Walter sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, the morning sun warming his face. The street, once a place of quiet isolation for him, now felt alive with potential. Across the road, the basketball court buzzed with activity as Darren, Keisha, Malik, and other kids played their usual game. This time, Walter wasn't watching with apprehension. He was smiling. His mind drifted back to the festival, to the conversations he'd had with neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years. Many had shared their own stories of mistakes, growth, and change, and Walter had found comfort in their openness. But it was the kids' acceptance of his apology, and their willingness to let him be part of their world, that had truly humbled him. Walter's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching his porch. He looked up to see Keisha standing there, her basketball tucked under one arm. "Good morning, Mr. Briggs," she said, her voice cheerful but shy. "Good morning, Keisha," Walter replied, gesturing for her to sit. "What brings you over?" Keisha hesitated, then said, "The festival was really fun. My mom said it reminded her of when the neighborhood used to have block parties. She wanted me to ask if you'd be willing to help organize another one sometime." Walter felt a swell of emotion in his chest. "I'd be honored," he said. "Tell your mom I'll stop by later to talk about it." Keisha grinned, her nervousness melting away. "Cool. Oh, and Malik says he wants a rematch in basketball. He says you got lucky last time." Walter laughed. "Tell Malik he better bring his A game." Building connections. Over the next few weeks, Walter immersed himself in the neighborhood like never before. He visited the community center regularly, not just to teach woodworking, but to help with other activities. He attended local meetings, contributed ideas, and even joined a neighborhood committee focused on youth engagement. The committee's first project was an ambitious one, transforming the neglected lot at the edge of the neighborhood into a community garden. Walter threw himself into the effort, using his construction skills to help build raised beds and benches. The kids from his woodworking class joined in, their energy and enthusiasm infectious. "Mr. Briggs, can we carve designs into the benches?" Darren asked one afternoon, holding up a chisel. Walter smiled. "I don't see why not. What did you have in mind?" Darren pointed to a sketch he'd drawn of the neighborhood skyline, complete with the basketball court and the community center. "I wanted to represent all of us." Walter's chest tightened with pride. "That's a beautiful idea, Darren. Let's do it." Facing the past. One afternoon, while working in the garden, Walter noticed a familiar figure walking toward him. Rebecca. She carried a folder under one arm, her expression thoughtful. "Dad," she said, sitting beside him on one of the newly installed benches. "You've come a long way. The neighborhood feels different now, and a lot of that is because of you." Walter wiped his hands on his jeans, his face flushing. "I just wanted to do what was right." Rebecca handed him the folder. "I think you're ready for this." Walter opened it to find a collection of letters and articles. Some were stories Rebecca had collected about racial bias and its consequences. Others were letters from people in the neighborhood, sharing their thoughts about the changes they'd seen in him and the community. One letter caught his eye. It was from Malik's mother. "Dear Mr. Briggs, when Malik told me what happened that day at the basketball court, I was furious. I didn't know who you were, but I knew what you had done could have hurt my son in ways you might never understand. But then Malik told me about how you apologize, how you've worked to make things right, and how you've become a part of their lives. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for what you've done. You've shown my son, and this neighborhood, that people can change. Thank you." Walter's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He set the letter down carefully, unable to speak. Rebecca placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not about erasing the past, Dad. It's about learning from it and doing better. And you've done that." Walter nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll keep doing it." The legacy of change. As the weeks turned into months, the changes in Walter and the neighborhood became undeniable. The community garden flourished, its vibrant blooms and thriving vegetables a testament to what could be achieved when people came together. The basketball court became a symbol of resilience, a place where kids of all backgrounds played side by side, their laughter echoing through the streets. Walter's woodworking class grew, attracting not just kids but adults eager to learn and connect. The projects became more ambitious, from small furniture pieces to collaborative murals that adorned the community center walls. Walter even started mentoring Darren, who was determined to pursue his dream of becoming an architect. One evening, as Walter and Rebecca walked through the garden, Rebecca said, "You've built more than just birdhouses and benches, Dad. You've built trust. You've built a community." Walter looked around, taking in the sight of neighbors chatting, kids playing, and families enjoying the space they had created together. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "Without them." Rebecca smiled. "You did the work, Dad, and it shows." A new future. Walter's journey wasn't over. It never would be. But he had learned that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a daily commitment to being better, to learning, and to giving back. He no longer saw himself as a man defined by his mistakes, but as someone who could grow beyond them. As he stood at the edge of the basketball court, watching Darren sink a perfect three-pointer, Walter felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known was possible. The past would always be part of his story, but it no longer defined him. He was no longer just a neighbor. He was part of a family. And for the first time, he truly felt at home. Healing the wounds of the past. Walter Briggs's transformation had begun to ripple outward, touching lives in ways he hadn't anticipated. The neighborhood was slowly becoming a place where walls of silence were replaced with bridges of understanding. Still, Walter knew there were parts of his journey left unfinished, and not everyone in the community had fully embraced the changes. For some, wounds still lingered, especially among those who had been most affected by his actions. The courage to confront. One crisp autumn morning, Walter decided it was time to address the lingering doubts and unspoken tensions. He had apologized to the kids and some of their parents, but he hadn't yet spoken to everyone his actions had impacted. Malik's mother's letter had reminded him that while forgiveness had been extended, trust was fragile and needed nurturing. He decided to host a smaller, more intimate gathering at his home, a place that had long been a fortress of solitude, but now felt like it could become a space of reconciliation. Walter spent the week preparing, with help from Rebecca, who had become his steadfast guide and ally. Together, they cooked, cleaned, and arranged his living room to feel warm and welcoming. On the evening of the gathering, Walter stood nervously by the door, clutching a pitcher of iced tea. The first knock came from Malik and his family. Malik's mother, Teresa, smiled warmly but held his gaze, her eyes searching for sincerity. Walter stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in. "I'm glad you're here," Walter said. "I've been looking forward to this." Unpacking the hurt, the gathering started quietly, with neighbors exchanging polite greetings and awkward smiles. But as the night went on, the atmosphere began to shift. Over cups of tea and slices of pie, the room filled with stories, some lighthearted, others painful. Malik's mother spoke about the fear she had felt that day of the court when she learned about the police arriving. "It's not just about that one day, Mr. Briggs," Teresa said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It's about what it represents. For families like mine, that kind of call could have ended very differently. We've seen it happen too many times." Walter nodded, his throat tightening. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. But I don't want it to stop there. I want to be part of the solution, part of making sure things like that don't happen here, or anywhere." Teresa studied him for a long moment, then said, "Actions speak louder than words, Mr. Briggs. And so far, your actions are saying the right things. Just don't stop." A shared vision. The evening ended with a renewed sense of connection. Neighbors who had once been wary of each other began talking about ways to keep the momentum going. Ideas flowed freely. More community events, workshops on diversity and inclusion, and mentorship programs for the kids. Walter promised to help spearhead these efforts, eager to continue what he had started. Before leaving, Teresa approached Walter. "You're doing good work," she said. "And for what it's worth, I'm glad Malik has you in his corner now. Just remember, this isn't a sprint. It's a marathon." Walter nodded, her words echoing in his mind long after the last guest had left. A new role in the neighborhood. Walter's commitment to the community deepened in the weeks that followed. He partnered with Rebecca and other neighborhood leaders to establish a formal mentorship program for local kids. The program paired adults with youth to provide guidance, support, and opportunities to learn new skills. Walter became one of the most active mentors, teaching woodworking and basic repair skills to a growing group of kids. Darren, Keisha, and Malik were regular participants, but the program also attracted new faces. Walter's garage, once a cluttered space of forgotten tools, transformed into a bustling workshop filled with the sounds of laughter and creativity. One afternoon, Malik presented Walter with a gift, a wooden plaque carved with the words, "Mr. Briggs' Workshop, where ideas take root." Walter blinked back tears as he accepted it. This means more than you know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Malik. Small victories, lasting change." The mentorship program soon bore fruit. Darren's architectural sketches became more sophisticated, thanks to Walter's guidance on scale and structure. Keisha began crafting intricate wooden toys for the local animal shelter. Malik, always brimming with creativity, started writing a blog about the projects he worked on, blending storytelling with hands-on learning. Walter saw himself reflected in their achievements, not as a man who had once been defined by his mistakes, but as someone who had helped nurture their potential. The kids' successes became his victories, their dreams a testament to the power of second chances. The road ahead. Months turned into a year, and the neighborhood continued to grow stronger. The community garden flourished, hosting seasonal markets and outdoor movie nights. The basketball court became a hub of activity, not just for games, but for impromptu gatherings and celebrations. Walter's house, once a symbol of isolation, became a welcoming space where people felt at home. One evening, as Walter and Rebecca stood in the garden, watching families laugh and mingle, Rebecca turned to him and said, "You've done more than I ever thought possible, Dad." Walter shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. This neighborhood, these kids, they saved me as much as I've helped them." Rebecca smiled, her eyes glistening. "Well, I think Mom would be proud." Walter looked out at the community he had helped rebuild, his heart full. For years, he had been a man defined by fear and resentment. Now he was someone different, someone who embraced change, sought connection, and worked to make the world a little better, one small step at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in a golden glow, Walter felt a profound sense of peace. Redemption wasn't a finish line, he realized. It was a journey. And as far as journeys went, he was exactly where he was meant to be.